When someone who has narcissistic traits experiences a long period of no contact, one of the first internal reactions is what psychologists often describe as a deep narcissistic injury. This does not mean physical harm or even emotional pain in the way most people experience it. Instead, it refers to a blow to the person's ego and self-image. For individuals who rely heavily on admiration, control, and validation from others, the sudden and prolonged absence of someone who once provided those things can feel deeply unsettling. The silence itself becomes a challenge to the identity they have carefully constructed. In many relationships involving narcissistic patterns, the dynamic revolves around attention and emotional supply. The narcissistic individual often positions themselves at the center of the relationship, expecting admiration, compliance, or constant engagement. Over time, the other person may become accustomed to responding, explaining themselves, defending their actions, or trying to repair conflicts. Even negative attention can still serve as a form of engagement. Arguments, emotional conversations, and attempts to fix the relationship all keep the connection alive and reinforce the narcissistic person's sense of importance. No contact disrupts that system entirely. When someone decides to step away and maintain silence for a long period of time, the narcissistic individual loses a reliable source of emotional engagement. At first, they may assume the silence is temporary. They might believe that eventually the person will return, send a message, or react in some way. But when days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, the reality becomes harder to ignore. The absence of response begins to challenge their belief that they have control over the relationship. For someone with strong narcissistic tendencies, the idea that another person can simply walk away can feel like an attack on their identity. Their sense of self often depends on being admired, feared, or at least acknowledged. When a person removes themselves completely, it creates a situation where the narcissist is no longer the central figure in that person's world. This can feel humiliating, even if they never admit it openly. Rather than reflecting on their own behavior, many narcissistic individuals cope with this injury by protecting their ego. They may convince themselves that the other person was weak, disloyal, or incapable of understanding them. This kind of thinking helps them avoid confronting the possibility that their own actions contributed to the breakdown of the relationship. Accepting responsibility would require a level of self-awareness that many narcissistic personalities struggle to maintain. Another response to this injury is anger, not always visible anger, but often a quiet resentment that lingers beneath the surface. The narcissistic person may feel that the other individual had no right to leave or to impose boundaries. From their perspective, the relationship was something they controlled, and losing that control can feel deeply frustrating. Even if they appear calm or indifferent, the loss of influence can continue to irritate them internally. Sometimes this injury also triggers a strong need to restore the balance of power. The narcissistic individual may begin thinking about ways to regain contact, gather information, or reinsert themselves into the other person's life. This is not necessarily driven by genuine emotional connection. Instead, it is often motivated by the desire to repair the damage to their ego and prove to themselves that they still hold influence. What makes this dynamic particularly complex is that narcissistic injury rarely leads to meaningful self-reflection. Instead of asking, "What did I do that caused this person to leave?" the focus tends to shift toward protecting the self-image they already have. They may rewrite the story, portray themselves as the victim, or convince themselves that the other person simply could not handle them. Over time, the silence created by no contact can become a powerful mirror. It represents a boundary that cannot easily be manipulated or negotiated. For someone who once had access to attention and emotional energy, that boundary can feel like a direct challenge to their authority in the relationship. And yet, the most important part of this dynamic is not the narcissist's reaction. It is the transformation that happens on the other side of the boundary. The person who maintains no contact begins to step out of the cycle of constant emotional engagement. The silence that feels like an injury to the narcissistic ego often becomes the very space where the other person begins to recover their clarity, their confidence, and their sense of personal control. After a long period of no contact, another very common reaction is the sudden attempt to re-enter the other person's life. This behavior is often subtle at first, and it can appear surprisingly casual. A message might arrive out of nowhere after months or even years of silence. It could be something simple like, "Hey, I was just thinking about you," or "Hope you're doing well." On the surface, it may seem harmless or even friendly, but in many cases, the intention behind it is not what it appears to be. For individuals who rely on control and validation in relationships, long silence creates an uncomfortable gap. They may start wondering why the person has not returned, why they have not reacted, and whether the connection has truly ended. That uncertainty can feel threatening to their sense of power. Reaching out again becomes a way to test whether they still have influence. These attempts to reconnect are rarely direct at first. Instead of acknowledging the reasons the relationship ended, they often start with something neutral. They might send a casual greeting, react to a social media post, or ask a simple question that invites a response. The goal is to see whether the door is still open. If the person replies, even briefly, the silence has been broken, and the dynamic begins to shift again. Sometimes the message may sound nostalgic. They might mention a memory the two of you shared, a place you visited together, or something that reminds them of the past. Nostalgia can be a powerful emotional trigger. It pulls attention away from the painful parts of the relationship and focuses instead on moments that felt meaningful or positive. When this happens, the person who maintained no contact may briefly question their decision or feel tempted to respond. In other cases, the approach can seem apologetic. The narcissistic individual may say something that sounds like accountability, such as, "I know things didn't end well," or "I've been doing a lot of thinking." These messages can give the impression that they have reflected on the past and changed. But it is important to understand that not all apologies come from genuine growth. Sometimes they are simply tools used to reopen communication. If the first message receives no response, the attempts may escalate. Another message might follow days or weeks later. The tone may shift from casual to more emotional, perhaps expressing sadness or confusion about why the silence continues. This can create pressure on the person who has chosen no contact. Silence can feel uncomfortable when someone repeatedly tries to engage. Another common strategy is indirect contact. Instead of reaching out directly, they might use mutual friends or acquaintances to pass along information. Someone might mention that the narcissistic individual has been asking about you, wondering how you are, or saying they miss the connection. These indirect messages are designed to create curiosity and emotional movement without requiring direct vulnerability. Social media can also become part of this pattern. The narcissistic individual might suddenly start viewing stories, liking old photos, or posting content that seems intentionally visible to the person who went no contact. Sometimes these posts are crafted to provoke curiosity or emotional reactions, such as displaying a new relationship, showing signs of success, or sharing dramatic statements about life and betrayal. What is important to recognize is that these attempts to reconnect are often less about rebuilding a healthy relationship and more about restoring access. When someone has been removed from the dynamic for a long time, the narcissistic individual may feel compelled to confirm that the connection can still be reactivated. A simple response can provide that confirmation. For the person who has chosen no contact, these moments can be challenging. Curiosity, empathy, or unresolved feelings can create the temptation to respond, but it is essential to remember why the boundary was created in the first place. Long periods of silence usually happen after repeated patterns of manipulation, emotional exhaustion, or broken trust. Maintaining no contact means recognizing that a single message does not necessarily represent meaningful change. True transformation requires consistent self-awareness, accountability, and long-term behavioral shifts. Without those elements, reconnecting often leads back into the same cycle that made the separation necessary. In many cases, the most powerful response to these attempts is the same silence that created the boundary in the first place. Silence does not feed the dynamic, does not restore the emotional supply, and does not reopen the door to manipulation. Over time, that boundary becomes clearer and stronger, reinforcing the decision to prioritize peace and emotional stability over temporary curiosity or pressure to respond. Another common reaction after a long period of no contact is the tendency to pretend that the relationship never really mattered in the first place. This reaction can seem confusing or even hurtful to the person who walked away, especially if the relationship once appeared intense, emotional, or deeply connected. But for someone with strong narcissistic patterns, minimizing the importance of the relationship can become a powerful way to protect their ego. When a person decides to go no contact and successfully maintains that boundary, it creates a situation where the narcissistic individual loses control over the narrative. They can no longer influence the other person's thoughts, emotions, or actions in the same way. That loss of influence can feel uncomfortable and sometimes even embarrassing. Instead of acknowledging that they were rejected or that someone chose to leave their orbit, they may respond by convincing themselves and others that the relationship was never significant to begin with. This form of emotional minimization serves several psychological purposes. First, it protects the narcissistic individual from experiencing vulnerability. Admitting that a relationship mattered would mean admitting that its loss has an emotional impact. For someone who has built their identity around superiority, strength, or control, that kind of vulnerability can feel threatening. By pretending that the relationship meant little or nothing, they maintain the image that they remain unaffected. Second, minimizing the relationship helps preserve their sense of power. If they openly acknowledge that the person who left played an important role in their life, it would also mean recognizing that the other person had the ability to walk away. That realization can feel like a loss of dominance in the relationship dynamic. By saying things like "it wasn't that serious" or "we weren't that close anyway," they shift the narrative in a way that protects their self-image. This behavior often becomes visible in the way they speak about the relationship to others. Friends, co-workers, or mutual acquaintances might hear dismissive comments that reduce the entire connection to something trivial. They may describe the person who went no contact as dramatic, overly sensitive, or simply unimportant. These comments are not necessarily accurate reflections of what actually happened. Instead, they function as a defense mechanism designed to reshape the story. In some cases, the narcissistic individual may even act as though the relationship ended on their terms. They might imply that they were the one who lost interest, that they moved on quickly, or that they were never fully invested. This narrative allows them to maintain the illusion of control, even if the reality was that someone else set the boundary. Another aspect of this reaction involves emotional detachment in public settings. If the narcissistic individual encounters the person who went no contact, they may behave as though nothing significant ever existed between them. They might appear indifferent, overly casual, or even dismissive. This performance is often designed to communicate that they are unaffected and that the past relationship holds no importance in their life. However, this outward display of indifference does not always reflect what is happening internally. The act of minimizing the relationship can be a way of managing uncomfortable feelings that they are unwilling to acknowledge. The silence created by no contact may still occupy their thoughts, even if they pretend otherwise. For the person who chose to go no contact, hearing that the relationship is being dismissed or minimized can sometimes create emotional confusion. It may lead to questions like, did it really mean nothing? Or was everything I experienced exaggerated? These doubts are natural, but they often stem from the narrative being reshaped by someone who is protecting their own ego. It is important to remember that the intensity of a relationship does not disappear simply because someone chooses to minimize it. The experiences, emotions, and lessons that came from that connection remain real for the person who lived through them. A narcissistic individual's attempt to reduce the significance of the relationship does not erase the impact it had. Over time, this strategy of pretending the relationship never mattered becomes another way the narcissistic personality avoids accountability. By dismissing the connection entirely, they remove the need to examine their own behavior or recognize the role they played in the breakdown of the relationship. Meanwhile, the person who maintained no contact continues moving forward. The boundary remains intact, and the space created by that distance allows for reflection, healing, and growth. In the end, the attempt to minimize the past says far more about the narcissistic individual's need to protect their ego than it does about the true meaning of the relationship. Another reaction that often emerges after a long period of no contact is a deep and persistent curiosity about the person who left. When someone successfully removes themselves from a narcissistic dynamic and maintains that distance for months or even years, it creates a kind of mystery that the narcissistic personality struggles to tolerate. The silence leaves unanswered questions, and for someone who once had access to the other person's emotions, thoughts, and daily life, that loss of information can feel unsettling. In many narcissistic relationships, there is a strong desire to know what is happening in the other person's world. This knowledge provides a sense of influence and psychological presence. Even if the relationship was filled with conflict, the narcissistic individual often remained connected through constant communication, arguments, or emotional exchanges. When no contact begins and continues for a long time, that steady stream of information disappears completely. At first, they may assume the silence is temporary. They might expect the person to eventually return, reach out, or react in some way. But when that does not happen, curiosity begins to grow. They may start wondering questions that they cannot easily answer. Are you happier now? Did you move on to someone else? Are you still thinking about them? Or have you forgotten the relationship entirely? These unanswered questions can become surprisingly powerful. Because direct communication is no longer available, many narcissistic individuals begin looking for indirect ways to gather information. Social media often becomes the easiest window into someone's life. They may quietly check profiles, look at photos, read posts, or watch stories without interacting. Sometimes they do this regularly, almost like monitoring updates from a distance. Even small pieces of information can feel important because they help fill the gap created by the silence. In some situations, they may also turn to mutual friends or acquaintances. A casual question might appear in conversation, such as asking how you are doing or whether anyone has seen you recently. These questions may seem innocent on the surface, but they often serve the purpose of collecting details about your life without directly breaking the no-contact boundary. Curiosity can also lead to speculation. When someone no longer has access to the truth of a situation, they may start creating their own explanations. The narcissistic individual might imagine scenarios that support their ego. They may assume that the person who went no contact is secretly miserable, lonely, or still thinking about them constantly. These imagined stories help maintain the belief that they remain important in the other person's life. At the same time, they may experience moments of genuine confusion. Narcissistic personalities often believe that relationships revolve around them and that others will eventually return to their orbit. When someone proves otherwise by maintaining long-term distance, it disrupts that assumption. The curiosity becomes partly about understanding how someone could walk away and stay away. This curiosity can sometimes turn into a quiet form of monitoring. They may keep track of changes in your life from afar, noticing things like career updates, travel photos, new friendships, or signs that you are building a life without them. Every new piece of information becomes part of the puzzle they are trying to solve. However, this attention is rarely motivated by empathy or genuine concern for your well-being. Instead, it often revolves around their own need to understand the loss of control. They want to know where they stand in your life, even if the answer is simply that they no longer hold a place there. For the person who chose no contact, this dynamic usually happens out of sight. You may never know how often the narcissistic individual checks your social media or asks about you. And in many ways, that distance is part of what makes the boundary so effective. Without direct access, the narcissistic individual is left with fragments of information rather than the full emotional engagement they once had. Over time, the silence itself becomes a powerful statement. It communicates that your life is no longer centered around the relationship that once consumed so much energy. While the narcissistic individual may continue wondering about your choices, your growth, or your happiness, the lack of access prevents them from influencing those things anymore. In the end, their curiosity reflects something deeper than simple interest. It reflects the discomfort of losing a connection that once provided validation, attention, and a sense of psychological control. And while they may keep searching for clues about your life, the most important truth remains unchanged. The boundary of no contact keeps your peace, your progress, and your personal growth outside their reach.